Joining us here in studio on my far right, the Right Reverend Thegu Mutahi, moderator of the PCA. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Ahiga.
Next to him is Wanjiru Gikonyo, an advocate for good governance and accountability. Welcome to the program as well.
Thank you, Ahiga.
And joining us from Naivasha is Eric Theuri, the president of the Law Society of Kenya. Eric, thanks for making time for us this evening.
Thank you, Ahiga. I'm glad to be here.
Good. And Eric, I'll just fire the first one at you. And I'll lean on your legal knowledge. Starting at the premise of all this, the whole bipartisan approach idea, which is a word that's become very popular over the last 2 days, but with different interpretations, depending on your political leanings from what we are beginning to see. Now, does our law, whether the Supreme Law or others, envision bipartisan engagements? What do they look like? What is stipulated within the law? And that we can then understand what is now outside of the law.
Thank you, Waiga. The bipartisan way of approaching national issues is a system that has really taken root in the United States, which practices a presidential system as we do here. And it implies that the majority side and the minority side, and usually you would find that the minority party and the majority party have different ideologies, but when it comes to matters of national interest or when there is a national crisis, that the majority party and the minority party will come together to cobble up an agreement that sometimes differs from the party ideology for purposes of achieving consensus, because the issue that they are dealing with is one of grave national concern that requires the parties to, in a way, eschew their ideologies and principles, but put the country first. Of course, you know that we have adopted purely presidential system of governance. And so therefore, this bipartisan approach, as we are speaking, is something that now is gaining a lot of traction and a lot of interest because of the kind of situation we find ourselves in. But the challenge that perhaps we will have is that we do not have strict party ideologies. And so therefore, that this issue of bipartisan, in my view, is actually political interest. And it's not a question of a difference in ideology that then have to be compromised in the national interest.
And I think that's where I actually want to pick up with Wanjiru, who's here with us in studio. This issue of bipartisan, if I quote the last words of Eric there, is an issue of political interest from where he sits more than anything else. And that concerns you.
Of course it does, because if we look at, the challenges facing the country, first is the economic crisis. And we've been talking about this for many years, because Kenya has slowly slid into an economic crisis even before COVID came because of mismanagement of the economy. And at the point when COVID hit, there was need for a bipartisan approach. And it's one of the things when I was advocating under Okoa Uchumi, we were asking for, which was we need government to admit we have a crisis, because at the time they were saying, no, the economy is, everything is okay, we are managing things, because they needed to keep borrowing so that they can just, try and balance, fill up the deficit, and not really come clean to Kenyans, because they wanted to keep spending on their kind of, legacy projects and things like that. So we have an economic crisis, which after this election is also showing up a political crisis. Because when you have a lack of confidence in the electoral system, you have a challenge where the opposition side says the technology specifications were not met. There's a black hole in this whole election system that we weren't able to get data to verify the veracity of the result. And it is possible that if we got that data, it may influence the result. Those are very valid concerns, but that shows that there is a political crisis. So we need the sides, the political divide to come together and say 13 years into implementing the Constitution of Kenya, it's high time we consider if it's what the gaps are and how do we deal with them. And that will require a national dialogue, and that will require the sides to frame the issues and how they want to discuss the issues without dividing the country, without splitting the country, without fomenting conflict in the country.
Are you concerned, and that's before I allow the Right Reverend Thego to come in, that where politicians and sometimes behind closed doors have that sort of national dialogue, where that has happened in the past, that a certain trend has taken place, do you have that concern today?
Of course, of course. We are seeing, body language and language actually very much inclined towards a political elite settlement. And it's very interesting with President William Ruto, because during the campaign trail, he said we will not change the constitution. Of course, he opposed the BBI. But then, within 3 months of being in office, he then presented a memorandum to the speaker to amend the constitution. But now, when you look at the response to the call for dialogue, he wants to push it through a parliamentary committee, indicating
he's following the Constitution.
Indicating he wants to make minimalist changes to settle, to create a political settlement. Dish out a little bit of CDF here, a little bit of money to the Senate. Let's create an office of the opposition and keep everybody happy. That's the elite settlement that doesn't deal with the issue that we have a cost of living crisis, we have a political crisis, lack of confidence full confidence in the electoral process, and there are possibly, other issues that are not yet on the table, such as devolution not being adequately funded, the issues of governance. So it is high time we had a dialogue, inclusive dialogue, and a comprehensive dialogue, and it's time to review and see what's not working.
And I'll come back to you to get what that exactly would look like, but let me hear right now from the Right Reverend Thego Mutahi, and thank you for joining us, Right Reverend. So what is the church's concern about the bipartisan process? We heard a bit of it in one of our news stories today, but what are their specific concerns this evening?
Well, Higa, we must start by thanking God that we are talking about conversations, dialogue now. Because last week there was no such a matter. It was tension, it was conflict, and there was a lot of trouble, you remember. So the fact that we are now talking about the nature of dialogue is a good thing. And we thank the president because he was able to boldly come and say, we need to engage the other side. And the Azimio side also said, we have called off the demonstrations so that we may engage. So that's something very good to begin with. When it comes to the kind of dialogue or engagement that we should have, we have been in this country for quite some time now, and we know the kind of conversations that have been there and how they have been concluded. And that's why we are a bit worried as a church that if it takes the direction that is prescribed, we might not see the light of the day. Because previously, you remember the churches through Fugamano started a conversation in regards to formulation of a constitution. And then the politicians came in and almost had hijacked it. And eventually there was a lot of bickering. We went to a referendum in 2005, and there was a lot of politics in it. But the church had envisaged, or rather the faith-based organizations had envisaged an agreement for all, bringing on board almost everybody. But it got lost along the way. Again, you remember in 1997, when there was talk about the minimum reforms that should be enacted. There was a very good conversation then, until again the politicians came in and they quickly got something called IPPG, and it helped them go into the elections. But that did not solve our problems once again. So when we, again, remember what happened in after the post-election violence, or 2008, and there were 4 agendas. The political agendas went through. Agenda number 4, which involved Wanjiru, was never dealt with. To date, it has never been dealt with. That's our only fear as a church, that if it's called bipartisan and it remains only in the hands of the politicians, they will settle their own matters, they will look at their interests, and Wanjiru will be left out. That is our only concern. But once again, I'll say we are happy as a country. We no longer have riots. We do not have policemen with water cannons and tear gas on the roads. So we can build on that. All of us can build on that, and the future is bright.
Okay.
However, since we have been students of this, of politics of this country, we must be very worried.
Okay, and I'm sure there are viewers watching wondering how can their voice be heard in whatever sort of bipartisan engagement will be done moving forward, just based on what the two of you have spoken to. And I'll be coming back to that shortly, and I'll also be engaging Eric Theory. But I'm told we also have an update. We continue to follow what's been happening in Manhattan, in New York, and former President Donald Trump, there's live footage there of his motorcade, has left the courtroom at 3:25 p.m. U.S. time, 10:25 p.m. Kenyan time, nearly 1 hour after entering that room. He pleaded not guilty to 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, according to a source within that courtroom. He entered the not guilty plea himself. That's what sources told CNN and ABC News as well. His defense attorney did most of the speaking during that 1 hour session. And of course, the photos we showed you earlier was of him sitting between his attorneys at the defense table. Of course, this is totally unprecedented for a former U.S. president. He hasn't spoken to the press as he headed into the courtroom, and it looks like he did not speak to the press as he also left that courtroom 1 hour later. And so this is something that we continue following for you and bring you updates as to what happens next, which I'm sure many of you are wondering about. Remember, the charges against him were stemming from a hush money investigation. The grand jury indictment was unsealed, revealing those 34 felony counts. And the former president says he will continue his 2024 bid and is slated to fly back to Florida after the arraignment. And this is his destination after this little drive out of that courtroom. All right, so we'll tell you more should we get that information, but let's bring you closer home even as we carry on with our discussion about the state of our democracy, even as the U.S. democracy is tested through that unprecedented arraignment. And Eric Theory, let me bring you back into this conversation. Whilst you're hearing what my panelists here in studio are saying, there's also an IBC selection panel, right? They've been working, they've made progress, and then you have this bipartisan process, and there has been contention about the manner in which the IBC selection panel was put together. And I'm sure the members of that selection panel sit tonight wondering what happens next. There's what is within the law, but sometimes a bipartisan process could change what is within the law. I don't know what your thoughts are in regards to that. First, as a lawyer, and of course, as someone who's an observer of trends in our country.
Waiga, you know, there's a very clear process that is set out in law and the IBC Act in terms of how vacancies are filled at the IBC. Of course, it is not lost to us that there are now complete vacancies in the IBC. There is no commissioner. And so therefore, the need to have the IBC reconstituted is one of a pressing national imperative. But secondly, we are also alive to the fact that very shortly, the IBC will also be engaging in the question of boundaries delimitation, which is an important national exercise. And so therefore, it is important to have an IBC in place to be able to undertake those. We do know that there are ongoing petitions, and there have been instances where the courts have successfully upheld petitions that have been filed challenging results of the last elections. And so at the end of the judicial process, there might be a need to conduct by-elections in one or two constituencies in the event that the court then does uphold the decisions of the High Court or the magistracy where it regards to the member of the County Assembly. And so therefore we need to have an IBC in place to undertake these very important national duties. So the challenge that we will be facing is that the current selection panel has been constituted as by law provided. And so therefore, if then there is what we call a bipartisan conversation, which in my reading of the law, I would not know where to place it, because you cannot have those kind of conversations when a law is already in place and it has already taken effect. So I still am lost, and I would want to see how the question of the panel would be resolved. Remembering that the panel only conducts interviews and sends the names to the president, and there is another parliamentary process for the appointment, where you expect that perhaps those bipartisan discussions then could be held. So there is still a lot of information that is not within our knowledge. There are so many gaps in terms of what exactly the discussions or the dialogue that are ongoing are going to focus on, and how then that discussion is going to impact on the law as it is. If you go back, you would remember that during the time for the National Accord, that there were certain amendments which were done that then created the interim electoral commission. Mm-hmm. But in the current scenario, we already have an IEBC that has been constituted as provided for in the Constitution. And there is a selection panel that has been constituted as provided for in the law. And so therefore it becomes extremely difficult to see how legally there can be a reconsideration of the panel, considering that the panel is made of representatives of certain bodies that have been given the power to nominate their representatives. So I still think that there's a lot of maybe political discussions that are ongoing to give us more sight in terms of exactly what is intended to be achieved and how they intend to achieve that. But okay, when you look at it in terms of the legal route, all right, it has a lot of hurdles.
Okay. And Wanjiru, just bring you into this conversation as well, and I know you might want to respond or talk a little bit about what he said, but also what we've seen today from both sides of the political divide is a struggle of how to move this bipartisan approach or strategy forward. One side seems to be proposing a pure parliamentary process. The other seems to be proposing a hybrid of sorts, a parliamentary process together with a national accord. Which of these processes would be the most inclusive in allowing Kenyans' voices to be heard?
Right, that's a very good question. And yes, I would like to add my voice very briefly to the issue of the selection panel and, the law. Elections are a political process, and they are governed in law of necessity, but they are, they manage the tensions and the pressures and the interest around politics. If the process of appointing the panel and the panel then appointing the commissioners is deemed to be biased or does not have the confidence of half of the country or the one side of the political divide, that's a problem. And in fact, President William Ruto in his statement considered that this is a matter that can be discussed and can be dealt with in law, because it can be Parliament makes the laws, and it makes the laws based on the debates and the deliberations they have. So I think it's something that can be negotiated, and that's why I think we welcome the fact that the president has opened up this discussion. But of course, the president then opened up the discussion and was, also in the same statement, quite keen that, and maybe you could say even categorical, that it is a parliamentary discussion, that we drive it through Parliament. And Parliament is a problem. Parliament is a problem, one, because it's an interested stakeholder. Part of the problem we have around our electoral process, possibly around the economic issue, is weak oversight on the part of Parliament. When you look at the enactment of Political Parties Act, there are some that have not really seen the light of day. Campaign financing hasn't yet been operationalized. When you look at the election laws and the kind of horse trading that goes on in Parliament, this has diluted the spirit of the National Accord. So the spirit of the National Accord that was, drawn from the reports of Krigler and WACO, that would have shaped a very robust electoral system that holds our political leaders accountable, was diluted because of the nature of Parliament we have. Parliament also has the an enviable reputation as being the largest auction house in Kenya, in Africa. I don't know if it still holds this, but parliamentarians tell us.
Parliamentarians watching this program are very offended.
I know they get very offended.
Unfortunately, they're not here to give their right
Yeah, they get very offended, but it was actually documented by a parliamentarian, Joe Hamisi, in his book when he was talking about the shenanigans that go on in Parliament. And we've also had other parliamentarians talking about brown envelopes. As recently as last year, brown envelopes being passed so that parliamentarians can approve the budget ceiling. We have reports, for instance, we were looking at one of the report on exemptions and the way, private sector then will lobby, some private sector, not all private sector, some of these private sector lobbies will engage parliamentarians. And you see that tax exemptions or tax increases that were supposed to take place suddenly disappear, or investigations that take place. So Parliament is a weak link in our democracy. Elections are a weak link, Parliament is a weak link. So is it and then also we've seen the President, and I think Reverend talked about that, the President, enticing members of the opposition to jump ship onto his side. So Parliament is really the President's playing ground. He's got a very good hold on what happens there.
His team say it's not enticing, it's partnerships and collaboration.
Right.
Parts of the country, and they stand by that.
But does it have the trust? So the issue is, does it have the confidence? And do we feel that we can then have a robust national dialogue? And maybe the last thing is public participation. We've been engaging, promoting public participation, engaging with Parliament, since the enactment of the Constitution. And we have a problem with public participation. We've gone to court on this. And in fact, a number of cases have been filed in various forms where you can go through the motions, but you're not really heard because Parliament is still a very elite house, and then it's governed by standing orders and certain rules that can impede a robust dialogue. So I go for the hybrid approach, so that you can have the political discussions taking place, and then you push in what needs to be enacted, amended through the legal process once the consensus has been built. And we want to have an inclusive process when you talk about the political discussion, including stakeholders from across the board, because we are all Kenyans, we all want the best for our country, and we'd like to be able to contribute to this process and save us from, kind of the madness that we've seen around the political contestation.
Right, Reverend, we've been here before. In fact, your opening statement, you walked us down history lane, and one wonders, what has been the issue that has ensured that what has happened in the past is that we only somehow seemingly only find short-term solutions or short-term wins. We never quite find the long-term sustainable solutions that would ensure that we don't have to keep coming back to the drawing board every 5 to 10 years to figure out what's gone wrong and what hasn't. Where do we get it wrong? How do we ensure that if whatever is decided upon by Kenyans is implemented, that we don't have to come back here in 2027, 2028, 2033, and have another conversation again?
Wehika, I think why we have not been able to move and seem to have mark-timed over time is because of what politicians usually say, that they have no permanent friends or enemies, but they have permanent interests. So in pursuit of their interests, they are not able to look at the next generation. They look at the next election. And therefore, anything that would save them to the trouble of thinking about the next generation is welcome. And therefore, I think that's why it is important to take this moment as very important. Because when political differences happen in this Kenya, who suffers? It's not necessarily the politicians. When we had electoral violence in 2007, 2008, the people who became IDPs were not politicians. It's the common people who moved from their homes, killed, women raped, children, orphaned, made destitute. These are the people who suffered. And therefore, any conversation that takes place in Kenya today, we must be very vigilant. Because eventually, when there is trouble, the politicians will sit back, invite us into their differences, like we saw last week. When there were demonstrations, it is the common people who went to the streets and they suffered. Of course, the leaders came at some point, but the people who really, who are where the tire meets the road,
or the brunt,
it is the ordinary people. You know, the young men, the ladies who are out there, and they were battered by the policemen. The police also suffered because they were stoned and were injured. Therefore, calling this conversation a bipartisan political conversation does not really address our problem as Kenya, because we have had such approaches previously, and they have not moved us forward. So I guess learning from mistakes, because they say that you learn from history, that you learn nothing from history, this is the time now to learn from history as Kenyans and say we are happy that the president and the Azimio leader said there should be a conversation. But let's wait a minute and decide, and since there are no elections coming in a year or two, we can now approach this matter in a more mature way, in a manner that is more sustainable than doing it the way we have done it before, only to, again, to come to 2027, elections are done, then thereafter there are differences over this or that, again another short-term resolution is found. How long shall we be this loud about? Even when you go into a loud about, you look for an exit at some point. We need to look for an exit out of these matters, and we are doing this out of love. We are doing this because we are concerned, and we do not want Kenyans to shed blood any other time. We do not want property to be destroyed. Again, we do not want to mar our image, because our image doesn't look good in Africa, in the entire world. You know, when you mention Kenya, the only things you can see are tires burning. We want to put an end to this, and it is possible. If we give ourselves a constitution, then we can also go through a discussion that is going to move us forward. And, let us not side with any political side at this moment.
Okay.
Let's look at Kenya. And when we look at Kenya, a resolution and a way forward is going to be found. Therefore, I believe, Wahiga, that the best approach that we need to have is lay down the rules of engagement. And let our political leaders, much as we need them, we also need parliament, by the way, because you see, whatever we discuss, we need to go to parliament to be enacted.
Make it into law.
Therefore, we need parliament. But again, it cannot monopolize the discussion, because we know that it is limited. It is politicians who are in parliament, they are looking at 5 years, they are wondering whether they will be re-elected or not. Those are their biggest concerns. But for us Kenyans, who are not interested in political positions, our only interest is food on the table, is security for our families, education for our families, medical care for our families, and whether when I leave this place, I'll get home safely. Those are our concerns.
Okay, I like food for thought in your parting shot there. Before I bring in Eric once again, let's look at some feedback. This is what you're saying this evening on this discussion via the SMS line 22422 and the hashtag NEWSNIGHT. I'll read a tweet first, an SMS first. Actually, no, let me start with the tweets. Okay, Jomo Gigi from Okoroine says, too many cooks spoil the broth. We were to hold our parliamentary functions with esteem for posterity of justice, then allow this institution to exhaust all ways to pacify the current political tiff. All right, let's look at the next one. Babu Michael, you say, after following political events in the country for some time, I am afraid the common Mwananchi will not benefit to the reasonable percentage from this so-called bipartisan engagements. It's purely political interests. Kamau Morris, you say, let us be honest and avoid these technicalities that panelists come to showcase on TV. The body that represents Kenyans is Parliament. Do we have another one? Okay. Jay Mukorene, you say, bipartisan talks is solely pegged on having a sober approach to mitigating the issues, dodging Kenyans, not leaders. Dogging Kenyans, I believe, not leaders. However, Parliament plays a pivotal role in legislation as mandated by the electorate. Do you have any others? Philemon, 1, 2, 3, you say any bipartisan approach must be addressed by independent institutions provided for by the law. And one last tweet, you say Mugasia K1. There cannot be any meaningful dialogue in a parliament that is deeply divided along party lines. Genuine dialogue should be outside parliament through an all-inclusive forum. So many perspectives. Via the SMS line 22422, you say, this is Nixon Dugire from Kindaruma, parliamentarians should now make laws to mitigate the problems we are facing. For example, how to handle election servers. Very interesting. And I'll read some more even as we continue. But Eric Thauri, even as I know you want to respond to that, and we will have to start winding down this conversation. When Kenyans hear the term National Accord 2008, what comes to mind is an act of the National Assembly to, at that point, that temporarily established or re-established the offices of the Prime Minister of Kenya with the creation of 2 deputy prime ministers. And they begin to wonder that could at the end of the day, could this actually yield more positions in government? And some would be concerned about that. What are your thoughts about what the law currently prescribes and what it would take to change the law, if anyone is thinking about that this evening?
Well, I think to change the law, it would just take the will of the 2 largest coalitions to agree. But of course, it will be subject to the test by perhaps the civil society in terms of whether that conforms to the structure of our constitution as was set out in the BBI case. I've always been one person who does not believe that in this country we need the sort of dialogue that is being advanced, because that is, for me, a political dialogue, and a dialogue that is focusing on the wrong direction that the country is taking. What we need to have is a national dialogue in terms of our fidelity to the law and to the Constitution. I find it a little bit interesting that at this point, the president is saying that the dialogue, the bipartisan approach must be made strictly within the laws of the country and the Constitution. And to that extent, he is right. But in his administration and the things that he is doing, has he been observing fidelity to the law? Actually, he has been acting to the contrary. And that is the reason why there is an agitation for a political discussion and all this talk about having a bipartisan approach to the issues facing the country. And so we have to be careful as we engage in this conversation so that we do not lose sight of what is needed to alleviate the cost of living. Now, if someone was saying that we are having a bipartisan discussion in Parliament to discuss the taxation regime, and remember, what we think is that we are taxing ourselves to death. We are not using taxation as a means to incentivize businesses, as a means to grow job opportunities, as a means to access opportunities for the hundreds or rather millions of youth that are unemployed or underemployed, because that is the conversation that we should be having, that we should be seeing bipartisan proposals on how to enforce our tax regime, on how to give reliefs to businesses and to farmers and to manufacturers, looking at the cost of electricity, what can be done, and what bipartisan approaches can be, economic proposals are being put forth. None of that is in the current conversation. And for me, I think that as a country, we need to focus on the institutions rather than the individuals. We need to focus on building independent, constitutional institutions that then can be able to hold the government to account and be able to ensure that the Constitution is implemented just the same way we are seeing in the United States, that a former president has been investigated, he has been charged, and during his regime, he tested the systems in the United States to a great extent, but they held forth because they have trust in institutions and not individuals.
Eric, thank you so much for that. And we will, in the interest of time, have to take that as your parting shot. But we will definitely be having this conversation more and more. And for you, Wanjiru Gikonyo, you've spoken quite a bit about an inclusive conversation, an inclusive dialogue. Give me 4 characteristics of this dialogue tonight. What does it look like if you're to paint a picture of it for Kenyans?
Well, one, we would have very clear terms of reference. And in my view, they would be drawn from a review of the National Accord. Where are we in terms of the implementation of the proposals that were made all that way back? Because we want to test our fidelity, we want to test how well things have worked. So number one, we would have an audit. The second thing is we would have very clear lines, a very clearly articulated process. And, you know, the BBI during the ruling talked about the steps for effective citizen engagement, because we have a constitution that is really a citizen constitution that was based on very vibrant civic education, very vibrant discussion, a lot of fidelity to the proposals that were made. So we would have a process that, you know, follows those steps of civic education, of outlining the key issues, harnessing the answer, you know, what comes out of it, and it would have transparency across the board. So, you know, I don't agree with Eric that, you know, the bipartisan kind of relationship in Parliament is adequate, because we have a political problem. We have a problem of a culture where we do not comply with the law. We have a problem where it's become the order of the day for parliamentarians and even Kenyans not to obey the law. So we need a discussion really to say what has gone wrong and how do we get what has worked, because we have some gains. How do we deal with these issues, and how do we do so together? Finally, the process would ensure that the citizen involvement is not tokenistic, is not nominal, and we've seen how that can be done. And it would be underpinned by accountability, because we have to have, and I don't agree that we focus on institutions and not the individuals, because individuals sit in office and they do things that either progress our constitution or undermine the institution. So accountability should be based on the individual and should be based on compliance with the rule of law.
And for you, Right Reverend Mutahi, the church has been cited front and center every time discussions around dialogue and bringing our leaders together comes up. What would you say is the church's, you've shared the strategy, the church's concerns. What's their strategy, if you're able to draw light into that a little bit, to push for what you're talking about tonight? When you leave here, you know, and as you have discussions as NCCK and other groups, to push for what you've spoken about, what Eric has spoken about, and what Wanjiru has spoken about as well. How would that look like, that engagement?
Indeed, we have, within our forums, we have always proposed what should be done. And you remember me mentioning that there was ufugamano. When the entire nation had no idea how a constitution could be formulated, the religious leaders came together at ufugamano, and they started moving a draft of constitution. And when Yash Palgai came, he built on that. Therefore, we are keen on observing, because we would like to give our leaders space, but at the same time, we are ready to move the process forward If we realize that things are not moving as they should, we'll challenge them and tell them, no, this country is bigger than all of us. Therefore, we cannot allow things to go wrong because, as I said, we are the victims. Like my own PCA church, our church was banned, yet we were not involved in the protests. We had not, proclaimed that we are on this side or the other, but we suffered. Therefore, any conversation that goes on, we should be part of it because we are victims as well. And even the people who lost their kiosks, the people who were beaten up, the people who died, the parents who lost their children, all those need to be moved. Therefore, as a church, what we would want to do is that going forward, we are going to make suggestions on how things will be done. We are holding meetings. We had one today. We had one last week. So we are going to hold meetings, and we are happy that the leaders listen to us. You had the president acknowledging that he has been influenced by what the church has said, or the religious groups have said. Therefore, we are going to have meetings. We first wanted to acknowledge the gesture from the president and the prime minister and say what they have done is very good because they have created an atmosphere of conversation. However, we would invite them to listen to us once again so that we can come with a way forward that is going to heal the country, because we want this land healed. We do not want any blood shed going ahead. We do not want any property destroyed. We do not want the image of Kenya to be soiled anymore. We can get it now. If we start off well with the sacrifices of our leaders, with the leaders accepting that they don't have a resolution to it, because sometimes our leaders do not admit that they may not have an idea, because the fact that you are being elected to parliament or to a certain office does not necessarily qualify you that you have all that it takes to lead us in this important engagement. This is a discourse that concerns every Kenyan, and that's why we will be advising when we get into it, because it's a great opportunity that we have been given. We need to learn with it and fix things in the right way.
Okay, and we'll take that as your parting shot. Thank you so much, Right Reverend Thegu Mutahi, moderator of the PCA. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts this evening. We've also had Wanjiru Gikonyo, an advocate for good governance and accountability, also joining us in the broadcast. Asante sana. And joining us from Naivasha is Eric Theuri, the president of the Law Society of Kenya. Thank you for making time for us as well, Eric, despite your program there. And thank you for everyone who's joined in and watched us from the start of the broadcast until now, even as we've given you updates from Manhattan. And right now, I think we can show you the some pictures before we... Oh, okay, I'm told we